Welcome to the Underscore Transformation podcast. My name's Jason West.
And my name's Joe Wales.
And together we're the founders of Underscore. This week's episode is the first in a bonus mini-series that focuses on the future of work and the impact that the global pandemic has had on organisations that were already dealing with seismic changes in the workplace. Given that these changes primarily affect people and business transformation is at its core a fundamentally human endeavour, we'll be talking to a number of HR professionals who have been on the front line of their organisation's response to the pandemic. This week and next, we're joined by three special guests. Mark Whedon, who's the International HR Director at Zora, Steve Hunt, who's Head of Talent Acquisition at Citi, and Richard Phelps, Management Consultant and co-founder of the Human Times news service. The focus of our discussion this week was on the rapid disruptive change to working practices brought about by the pandemic and their organisation's response over the past few months. There's some really great practical advice and real-world experience in this week's episode, isn't there, Joe?
Absolutely there is. In fact, there was so much content, Jason, that we've had to split this discussion over two podcasts. Yeah. In this week's episode, Jason, we're dealing with the immediate changes to working practices and the initial stages of our guests' response. Mm-hmm. And then next week, we'll be focusing a lot more on the medium to long-term implications of the changes made in the past few months.
Perfect. So we've got three expert HR professionals lined up ready to talk to you today. They've got first-hand practical experience of dealing with rapid disruptive change. So let's hand over to them now to introduce themselves and we'll get started with our conversation.
My name is Mark Whedon. I'm HR Director at Zora. We are a US-based technology company, so we power those organizations which provide subscription-based services to their customers. In my role, it's a generalist HR role across the whole HR spectrum, and most of my role is looking after the non-US territories across EMEA and Asia Pacific outside of the US. As you mentioned, I also founded and chair the International HR Forum, which is a home to around 210 HR directors with international remits. I dread to think how long ago that was. I think it was 13 or 14 years ago.
Thanks, Mark. Next up, we have Steve Hunt, who heads up talent acquisition at Citi in EMEA.
Thanks, Jason. So I work for Citi, the global financial services provider supporting institutions, governments, corporations, as well as consumers operating all over the world. I'm the EMEA head of talent acquisition, so we're hiring around 10,000 people on an annual basis into 54 different countries, leading a team of just under 200 across the region. Prior to my time at Citi, I was the global head of talent acquisition at Coupang, an e-commerce provider based out of Seoul, very similar to Amazon. Prior to that, I was with Qatar Airways in the Middle East, running global recruiting as well. And prior to that, with the Talis Group for a number of years, building out a talent acquisition model from the UK into other countries. And before I was on the corporate side, I was 11 years as an executive search consultant.
Thanks, Steve. And we're delighted to be joined by Richard Phelps, who's the co-founder of the Human Times, management consultant and serial entrepreneur.
Thanks, Jason. I'm co-founder and owner of the Human Times. The Human Times is a daily digital newsletter that we send out to many thousands of HR professionals globally. We have 4 editions: Middle East, North America, UK, Europe, and Scandinavia. It's free of charge for anyone who would like to subscribe to that. My background is basically as a management consultant. I worked for Towers Watson, then started my own business in people analytics and sold it to PwC and became a partner at PwC and led their global HR consulting practice. But good to be here today.
Thanks, Richard. Now, we're going to get started this week talking about the future of work. It's been a hot topic well before 2020, and it's a broad headline covering a wide range of stories and ideas, from automation and AI through flexible project-based working and the gig economy to utopian or perhaps dystopian visions of a new social contract that includes a generous universal basic income, to address a future mass underemployment caused by the rise of the machines. Perhaps if we start with you, Mark, in your industry, has coronavirus simply accelerated inevitable change or presented something more like an existential threat?
Well, just looking at Zora, we're in the very fortunate position of being a cloud-based company. And so we have recurring revenues. So, we've got a fairly predictable revenue stream. And we've got money in the bank. So we had, before we floated in April 2018, we had 3 rounds of funding and, a fairly healthy, bank balance, and the flotation on the New York Stock Exchange gave us a little bit more. So it hasn't been a threat to our existence in the same way it has been to other organizations, particularly those in the leisure, hospitality sectors, for example, where I know it's had a massive impact. But if you do take things at a broader level, not wanting to limit the terrible impact that COVID has had, there has been a seismic political, economic, and social disruption caused by the pandemic. And what I'm seeing, even within Zora, which is quite insulated compared to other businesses, but certainly through my network as well, what we're seeing is there's been more change in the world of work in the last 3 months than, say, over the prior 3 decades, I'd suggest. And again, even though we've been reasonably fortunate from a stability perspective at Zora, we're still dealing with stuff that we've never had to deal with before. So you're having to deal with a pandemic and all that entails in terms of pivoting from quite an office-based culture before to one which is 100% remote, more or less overnight. That's put a lot of stress on the organization. But, the great news is we're still here, we're still fighting. So, it's had a big impact on us in terms of how we deal with sort of business continuity, employee engagement, all the impact around that. So it's been a busy time, yes.
Thanks for that, Mark. And Steve, from a different angle, City, obviously a vast organisation. How's it affected life in City?
Well, I think it's fairly nuanced depending on the starting point. I think as a completely global organisation, obviously we're used to working with lots of international stakeholders remotely. So I think that you have a lot of credit in the bank if you start from that point. I think the challenge has been, as it's evolved, I think, to start with, it was very much about how can we continue to serve clients? How can we continue to successfully operate and get 190,000 people working remotely? So, obviously logistical technology challenges, people challenges. But I think once we got over that crisis period, it was then, how do we operate more effectively in this mode, and how do we then think about the future? And there's so many issues because, particularly from a people perspective, as I said, I think you've got that cultural credit of having people who've worked together for a long time, and as a global organisation with a lot of tenure, that really helps because you've built up a lot of those relationships over time. But now, sort of 3 months into it, you think we've got thousands of people who've joined the organisation that have never been to an office. So we're now facing a completely different set of challenges than we were just 2 months ago.
Yes.
Particularly when you think about things like cross-border working. So you've got people who, because of the pandemic, are working in one location but actually are employed in another location. So then that really drives a lot of discussions around location strategy. And obviously talent. So many challenges, but very nuanced as the time has passed.
Yeah. And then at the other end of the scale, I guess, Richard, the Human Times is about the same age as Underscore, about 4 years old, I think. So it'd be great to get your perspective from the Human Times perspective, but also what you're seeing in the broader industry is, obviously you guys process a huge amount of news around people and human resources.
I mean, operationally, from our perspective, it's been quite positive because we have been forced to become much more digital, and we're forcing our not so forcing, but people are becoming more independent and resilient around the digitalization of work. So it's actually been quite positive. Also, I mean, we basically deliver our news remotely through the internet. And it's been very good for our business. We've found that in terms of our subscribers, they've shot up. And we've just launched a new product called the World of Work, which is the largest media intelligence database in the world. And we're getting a lot of interest in that. So from our perspective, it's been frankly quite positive. And the negatives, I guess, and I'm sure it's the same for everyone, is that we're on Zoom calls a huge amount of the time, and it's getting used to the new environment. Well, it's not so much getting used to it now, but it's become more normal. But I think more broadly, when we're looking at the whole news piece, clearly, in terms of the future of work, I mean, everything's sped up. We've had to do all this operational work, or organizations have, spent thousands and thousands of people who work from home over 2 or 3 days' notice. Organizations are basically now looking, I think, more towards, well, what next? I mean, people have been working at home for 2 or 3 months, and I think there are some real questions now about how do we manage ourselves through the recession, because I think it's quite relatively easy in terms of getting massive change in a crisis, but we're going to now start to face a new normal of more and more people working remotely. How do you foster engagement? How do you, there are advantages as well. So there are many pros and cons, but it opens many questions.
Yeah. And we'll get on to the kind of what comes next piece. But before we do, as we focus on those early stages of the crisis, the kind of the survival stage, what were the kind of the key challenges that faced HR functions, and how well set up were they to respond as quickly as they had to respond to the demand?
I found it quite interesting and challenging in the sense that although the pandemic was slowly creeping beyond Beijing, and we're a global organization, we've actually got an office of about 130 people in Beijing. So we probably got an early heads up that something was afoot. And so we were trying to do things within the business that other businesses hadn't quite cottoned onto, particularly around closing offices early, et cetera. So the initial challenge from an HR perspective was frankly getting some leaders to acknowledge that there was an issue which we actually had to respond to, particularly in those regional sales offices we have where there's still customer meetings going on, there are deals which had to be closed, negotiations, training, all that sort of thing going down. And I'm kind of saying, actually, it's coming our way. There's cases increasing in Milan, in Madrid, etc. So the initial challenge for me was getting to leaders to acknowledge, actually, we do have to do something here. And then once that tipping point had been passed, it's then around working with the leaders to ensure that there's business continuity. So making sure that there's minimal disruption to the business. We still got pipeline to build, we still got deals to close, etc. So making sure that we were able to close the offices but maintain our productivity, became the next challenge. And around all of that then leads to how you actually engage with your teams at a time when it's new to everybody. So it was very much uncharted waters, and you're basically going across this uncharted ocean, navigating blind to a certain degree. And so the final challenge to us was kind of wrapping our arms around this to ensure that we had a globally consistent approach as to how we respond to the crisis as it hit different parts of our organizations at different times and in different ways. And so to that end, we kind of created a global, initially it's called the COVID crisis team. So we created that team with the initial remit to own office closures, business continuity, scenario planning, engagement, internal comms, customer engagement, all that sort of thing. And to be fair, we actually, if we look back at what we've achieved over the previous 3 months, it's actually been a phenomenal amount. So once we got the initial over the initial hump of, yes, we've got a problem, we need to respond to it, let's put our arms around it, then it started to work pretty well. But I have to agree that there were initial challenges faced by HR.
Yeah. And were these, did you have kind of emergency plans in place that you could draw on, or was this very much dealing with the crisis as it unfolded?
So we have business continuity plans for certain scenarios anyway. And so most of them do involve, for example, if we lose our IT infrastructure or if we lose access to a particular office, etc. But they're quite local and they're quite event driven. So we had to deal with developing a new set of scenarios, which was based around somebody wandering into the office who tests positive for COVID. So we hadn't had a pandemic flavor to our business continuity plans. So we very quickly had to adapt to that. And the scenario plans were all built around, if I've been in contact with somebody who's suspected of getting COVID or tested positive to COVID, or I get it myself, if I turn up to the office, what's the scenario there within the office? So you've got to be able to trace people who've been in close contact with this person. At what point do we decide to take a decision that we're going to close the office? And in the end, we just took the view, it's not going to get any better very quickly. So we're just going to shut all our offices down anyway. So, that kind of, we did 2 weeks worth of scenario planning and very quickly decided, let's not bother the scenario. So let's just close the offices down. So we were very quick before most companies actually to close our offices down. That happened early March, I think it was. And
how often were you meeting as a group, this kind of core crisis management group that you pulled together?
3 days a week, and we still do. We still do.
In terms of HR's ability to respond to it, because you guys or the HR team would have, like everybody else, would have had to have operated remotely. Did you have any challenges around infrastructure in systems, tools, processes that actually gave you a bit of a headache in having to do all of this work remotely?
We found that we are particularly geared up to work remotely, actually. So we have a very good IT infrastructure. The only area where we had problems was in our India office. So we have 200 people in Chennai. There's cultural, personal and technology issues at play there, because a lot of people share homes with family members, the broadband's not great, etc. So the connectivity was an initial issue. But again, as because we had this crisis element to the COVID team at that place, we very quickly put in orders for, I think, we ordered about 100 data cards, for example. So those people who had dodgy broadband connection, they were able to get sent data cards. So the actual disruption to the business when we actually did shut the office down was absolutely minimal.
If you'd like a few more tools in your crisis management kit bag, visit _group.com/CMR toolkit to hone your crisis management skills and lead your organization through recovery. Steve, from a city perspective, you're shipping thousands of people into major financial centres each day, and you've got high frequency trading that requires systems being managed locally. How it sounds like probably quite a challenge. How was it for you?
Well, actually, quite similar to what Mark was describing. Obviously, the organisation is very well prepared from a disaster recovery perspective to move critical functions to second sites, and as well is set up to work remotely. But I think that the biggest challenge from an infrastructure perspective was you don't expect to be able to have to get the entire organisation working remotely within a space of a couple of months. And as Mark was describing, it is very similar in terms of phasing. Obviously, our Asia colleagues were living with this from January onwards, and then started to hit in Europe, obviously in February. So once it became a global situation, then I think the dynamics changed, because we had to then get more or less the entire organisation working remotely. And there are certain roles that are obviously site critical, but I think what we found over time is that there were less site dependent positions than we thought, and that we get more and more teams working productively quicker than we thought we could. So I think we learned a lot, as we had to react. But it throws up different issues at different points. I was talking about the individuals. I think it's very, very personal from an employee perspective. I think a lot of leaders Might be people who have children and, are well set up to work at home. If you think about some of those metropolitan centres where you're hiring lots of people in their 20s, for example, they might be living in houses with 2 or 3 other people, and they might not be well set up to work. So, we had lots of situations where people just didn't have the equipment. So we had to respond to get people that equipment, either to reimburse them when they bought it, and then obviously to have a more consistent way of them buying that equipment through the company and it being delivered to them. So, multiple things to think about as the crisis unfolded.
And I think it's something Richard alluded to. We've had overnight, and you all alluded to, we've had overnight changes to working practices with, just suddenly everyone's remote working that can work. So how has that changed how people are managed in this short term? That's a question to you all.
I would say I think it very much depends on culture. I mean, I think obviously certain positions, measurement of performance is very, very clear. And therefore, if you have those type of metrics and data that make those type of roles very, very easy to measure, then I think people are a lot more comfortable with that. I think there's, because we have a full range of roles and levels and locations, there's so many dimensions to how you manage people. So I think that culture is the critical thing. But, it's something that certainly we're still adapting to. And obviously, culture and manager capability at all levels is something that we've really focused on. So we've particularly focused on the learning and development aspect. So really focusing on resilient leadership and how we provide examples to managers of how to tackle particular situations. That's actually been a kind of daily exercise that we've done. I think equally the communication to employees is really, really key. So Mark talked about crisis management. That was something we had daily to begin with, but now it's down to, I think, two times a week. But number of town halls from an HR perspective, we started doing those weekly. Now moved those back to every 2 weeks. Our CEO has conducted town halls on a bi-weekly basis. Equally in each country, leaders have done that. So I think that communications strategy is very, very critical. And again, has changed over time. If you think at the beginning, people were very, very concerned, obviously from a personal perspective. So some of those questions to start with were, how quickly we're closing offices and getting people set up to work from home. And then it comes on to, what's this going to mean for me? What's this going to mean for my, my future? And obviously a lot of nervousness around that, particularly as government started to put in intervention measures. So different points of how the crisis unfolded, I think you've had to respond very differently from a people perspective.
You mentioned earlier the challenge of integrating 1,000 new hires virtually. I mean, how has that been managed, and is that something of the results of that sort of surprised you? Did you think it would have been possible prior to the pandemic to have integrated that number of new people into an organization in a way in which you've done?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think a lot of people have been surprised at how well we've been able to do it. I think we're primarily an office-based company.
Yeah.
But if I think about it, just from my personal perspective, I could go into London 4 days a week and certain days not have meetings with anyone in London and just be on VC, with multiple people in different locations. But I do think that credit, that cultural credit of having built those relationships, if you then go remote, even though a lot of your work already is remote, it's much, much easier. I think the first challenge was obviously, from a technical perspective, how can we remote on board? So I think once we'd solved, the process and the technology issues, it was then, okay, well, how do we settle people into the company? And, onboarding is something we focus on in terms of the stimulation anyway, both from let's get people understanding how to use systems, let's get them, compliant. But I think, how you embed them in the teams is something that we're still doing. But I think that comes back to my point around manager capability. I don't think managers are naturally set up to be able to do that. So, that communication of how you how you do check-ins with your teams, for example. So I had actually the kind of opposite concern as a leader of a team, across a number of countries, which was, it's great that we're doing all of this leadership communication because that caters for the big ticket items. But actually, it's very, very personal. Depending on your individual circumstances, I've got certain people in my team that were living on their own and therefore may not have seen anyone for weeks. So I think it really depends on the individual. So making sure that the manager level, that had the teams of, let's say, 2 to 10 people, were having really regular check-ins with all of their staff, but particularly those that had joined and never been to an office was really, really critical to make sure that those people could culturally embed in the organisation. But, it's something we're still learning. We're putting in various new programs to support that. But I think, we're getting to that point now where 3-4 months in, that's starting to bite a little bit because it's becoming more normal. And how do you cater for an environment like that? I think everyone is challenged by that.
And have you noticed any sort of impact on time to productivity of those individuals that have been onboarded remotely, or has it been largely the same?
I think it does depend on function, of course. I can say from my own perspective that we have this saying that we say it's not business as usual, but we're operating as usual, and we are fully operational. Over the last 3 months, there are thousands and thousands of people around the world. So we've proved that's possible. The next challenge is how do we maintain it in an environment where certain places will go back, but obviously there won't be a full capacity in particular offices. Other countries may not be going back, so you're going to get a very mixed pattern as we go through these next few phases.
Yeah, and Mark, has that been your experience? Is that kind of ring true for you?
In terms of the cultural impact, we assuming that you at a base level cultures around how you do stuff, then as a result of the more or less overnight changes which were made, we had to do a lot of changes to a lot of our processes, and so a lot of the ones which Steve just talked to, we had to go 100% virtual. So hiring, onboarding, development, I'd say that they've been the most impacted ones. It's led to us to consider how effective we were in the first place at these particular areas. Has time to productivity been impacted? Probably, because we were very large before on the onboarding side, in particular around doing boot camps in the US. So new hires to our development team or our sales organization or global services, etc. They went to the US for 2 or 3 years worth of training, 2 or 3 weeks worth of training in one go, and all of a sudden that's fallen away. So now we've had to develop remote content and remote workshops, so that knowledge which you have for 3 weeks, 8 hours a day, you can't possibly hope to have that over Zoom. So we've had to reimagine how we do it, and it's been a good process because you really get to think what is the core of what we're trying to disseminate here. So it removes a lot of the fluff, I guess I'd want to say. But the key thing here is whatever you're doing in terms of looking at how COVID's impacted certain aspects of your culture or the way you do things is actually there's 2 things. So one is you've got to put employees at the center of what you do. So when you're considering any transition, the first question should be, what is the employee experience going to be? And that should be the anchor point for any subsequent discussion around it and what you eventually roll out. The second thing for me is, although 99% of the companies are kind of in new territory here with all the remote stuff, there are businesses out there which have already been doing this. And so learning from them is a good thing as well. So there's companies like GitHub, for example. There's GitLab as well. They make they're 100% remote, and they've got on their website how they do it. GitLab has got their remote working manifesto. And, for those of you who are struggling with this in terms of impact on culture and how you manage the remote environment, it's well worth a read. It's not particularly long, but it nails the situation perfectly because it talks to how you manage a distributed rather than centralized organization, the flexible working regime which you put in place rather than working the set worked hours, recording knowledge sharing rather than relying on hearsay and verbal explanations, the importance of documenting process, transparency around your communications, the focus on results rather than hours worked, the importance of comms, all that sort of thing. So there's a lot of good information out there already from companies who are in this situation already pre-COVID.
And there's been a lot of reports in the news, and I'm sure we've all experienced a degree of this ourselves, is that there's been this increase in mental health issues over the past few months. And a lot of these issues arrive at the door of HR. Richard, from your perspective, looking at this from the Human Times and looking at these kind of articles and things out there, have you seen kind of any interesting patterns in this, and any examples maybe of good practice and how people are responding?
Well, Jason, before I do that, I'd just like to maybe add a few points to the previous.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Thanks.
Points around, the cultural changes or whatever. I think that it's from a broader perspective, it's fascinating because what has had to happen over such a short period of time has been totally transformational, getting thousands and thousands of people to just suddenly work at home. That has meant that the employer has had to, from an employee perspective, has had to trust employees an awful lot more, which I think has been quite difficult, because it's not something that employers are used to. So there's been, I think an awful lot more required from the employer in terms of trusting staff to work from home and remotely. There has, I think, this has raised the issue, I think going back to what Mark was saying, I mean, the remote working world is now here. I mean, it gives us a lot more flexibility. I think a lot of organizations are now trying to work out, well, we've got to face the fact that employees will not necessarily want to come back into the office all the time. As part of there are, as you say, there are a lot of other organizations who've just fully moved to remote. So, and that's, it may well be, for example, that employees want to only come into the office for 2 or 3 days a week. And this is kind of helping organizations understand that people actually can be as productive, if not more productive, working from home. So that all needs to be thought through. I guess from a recruitment perspective as well, it's going back to Steve's point, you can probably hire people now much more broadly in terms of locations than ever before, or organizations can. The idea that people have to hire people within a country for a role, it's probably less of an issue now than it ever was. So I think that, the whole employer-employee relationship is there's going to be more questions around how that develops into the future from where we are now. There's a lot of things that, were accepted in the past may not now be true. I mean, it may well be that people actually can work more productively at home. And that being in the office, is not as necessary as people thought it was. Yes, you're going to miss things like, maybe innovations, actually being with people, but a lot of that can potentially be, or some of it, done over Zooms and Teams. So I think there is a challenge for leadership to kind of think about this in terms of, well, how does this play out from now? What have we learned? And obviously, more important than everything, how does it impact our customers, and how can we deliver better propositions and solutions to our customers? Specifically, for example, I guess the question now is, when do you need to have a physical meeting, and when do you not need to have a physical meeting? Or what is the advantage of meeting someone now physically as opposed to remotely? Because there's big impact on those decisions in terms of costs, in terms of relationships, in terms of sales. But I think HR teams need to start thinking that through. I think that, it does raise huge, well, as we know, huge immediate issues really for organizations, especially as we're now going to be moving into a recession. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about V recovery, but it may happen. I hope it does happen. But if you look at all the IMFs, etc., talking about is we're going to be going into a very difficult period.
So we're going to pause the conversation here for this week. Joe, what stood out for you?
It's a fascinating discussion. I mean, this is it's almost been groundbreaking for many HR professionals out there, and it's been really interesting to see how HR have stepped up really and taking a leadership role in influencing boards to make the right calls when under incredible amounts of pressure that they wouldn't have experienced ever before.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting, actually, sorry to cut across you there, that Mark was talking about actually having to persuade senior leaders that this is an issue, it's coming, we can see it happening over in Asia, we need to kind of really get on board with this, and meeting some of that resistance and what they had to do to overcome it.
And you can see that there are boards now. You can sense that the board is actually leaning on the HR function to provide that guidance and advice that dealing with the chaos in which many organizations have sort of found themselves in. So it's really interesting. And on a practical level, how Citi have dealt with the challenge of onboarding 1,000 employees or new hires and remotely. That is really fascinating. I mean, if you were to ask the question, even probably 12 months ago, when technology is so advanced, whether organizations would see that as a feasible option, I'm sure 100% of organizations would probably consider it impossible to onboard that number of people remotely. So that is really an incredible achievement for an HR function.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like Mark's point on GitLab's remote manifesto. I've taken a look. It's really well worth a read. Really and we've included a link in the show notes because, it's worth having a look through there. And likewise, if you'd like to get in touch with any of the members of the podcast today, you can also find a link to their LinkedIn profiles in the show notes. So well worth have a look there. So it would be great if you could hit subscribe to make sure you don't miss the second part of our discussion, where we're going to focus on engagement, employee experience, what the office is going to be like post-COVID. Hopefully there is a post-COVID, and some practical advice to surviving the world of Zoom meetings. If you found this week's episode useful, please leave a review and share this podcast with your colleagues. So thank you for listening, and we look forward to catching up with Steve, Mark and Richard next week.